everybody, and welcome to the Planning Pulse. It's me, Sam Batchelor, Development Manager here at Wealden District Council, and today I'm joined by James.
Yes, hi, James Webster, the Planning Policy Manager here at Wealden.
Brilliant. So we've had a little break over the summer, haven't recorded one of these for a while, but we're bringing a couple of things to you today. So in the first instance, I'm going to hand over to James, who wants to give us a bit of an update about stuff related to the local plan.
Yeah, so just to basically, tell you where we are with it. So, as we looked at March for the LDS adoption, so that was the timetable for the local plan following the NPPF changes last year. We're still on the schedule at the moment for that, and we're sort of looking at trying to look at a date for full council to try and get out on the Regulation 18, next Regulation 18 plan, hopefully before the end of the year. So that's the plan at the moment, and there'll be more coming on that in the next week or two, or the next few weeks, so yeah. We'll let you know.
So just to briefly remind people then, we did have a Regulation 18 consultation last year, but those changes to the NPPF made us not go back to the drawing board completely, but we had to review the situation with regard to uplifting housing numbers. And so we've been looking at that, right, and we're intending to go out again for consultation. We
have, and we've had a lot of evidence being updated as well. So one of those things, as you quite rightly mentioned, is around housing numbers. So we are looking at EU local housing needs assessments, an update to that, to EU economic needs assessments, town centre updates. We're looking at transport work and the SA, and looking at all the, and obviously probably the big thing that people that are in the audience listening to today is around sites, and that is certainly something we've been progressing over the summer. So we'll hopefully keep your ears to the ground, and you should find out fairly shortly when that will be.
Okay, so we'll put some links in the notes about where you can find some of that planning policy information.
Yeah.
You mentioned the town centre stuff there. Is that a good point to mention the town centre study now?
Yes. So we had a town centre study published in 2022. That looked at sort of the market across the Wealden district and slightly further out. There's a bigger catchment there, and as part of that process, we've asked a company called NEMS, who are based up in Newcastle, so you might hear a Geordie accent or two. So they are now speaking to our Wealden residents as of tomorrow, which will be Friday the 26th, to discuss with Wealden residents and those slightly outside of that catchment as well, so it's a little bit further afield, around your shopping habits. So don't be surprised if you do get a call around that. It's quite we're doing that work to try and update what people's shopping habits are, and obviously since the work was previously done, we were actually sort of in a position in 2021 around COVID still, and obviously that's long hopefully gone for the time being. Yeah. So we obviously, the updates around that, will then look at the other towns that are local to us as well as our own towns, and how you've changed your shopping habits since then. So it's an interesting piece of work.
And it helps us, doesn't it, in terms of kind of making allocations around kind of retail, protection of our high streets, and what policies might manifest in relation to those things.
Absolutely.
So quite an essential study in that respect.
It is, and we didn't have any. We had a very small need for retail floor space in the last plan. We'll see whether there's any differences to that, and obviously we'll need to work through that process if there is an uplift in that, or indeed a downlift. I suspect it will more likely be an uplift, but we'll see.
Okay, we'll see what comes out of that.
Yep.
And then lastly, in terms of kind of policy-related updates, you wanted to mention as well about our statement of community involvement?
Yes, so you may be aware that and I think we did it on this podcast, that we're updating our statement of community involvement, and that involves all public consultations, so for both mine and Sam's team around planning applications and the local plan, is how we want to involve you in all those sort of processes and the protocol for that.
Yeah.
We had a consultation on it that ended a few weeks ago now, so we've had a few comments around the SCI, and we're looking at those currently.
Okay.
Hopefully, once we've reviewed that, we'll be looking at trying to take that SCI formally through to full council in November. Just again, keep your ears to the ground, and have a look at our website around next full council in November, and the SCI will be there, hopefully on a publication.
It's been good to review it, right? Because it's always good to just kind of check in, see how it is that we have consulted people about, the local planning process and plan applications. Is there kind of better practice out there now, which means that we should review that and adopt it? So we've taken taken that into account. We've also taken the opportunity to make reference to things like AI and how that might be used in consultations and the responses that we receive in terms of local plans. So yeah, definitely keep a lookout for it.
Yeah, no, thank you.
So thanks, James, for those policy updates. We also just wanted to let you know about a recent change that's happened in the world of planning recently.
Yeah, there's quite a lot in the news around flood risk and potentially changes to the National Planning Practice Guidance around it. So
That's right, yeah. So when the government published the new NPPF in December, they made some changes to the sections that relate to flooding and flood risk, particularly references to the types of instances in which you'd need to consider flooding in relation to development. So it's always been the case that developments that were within flood zones, as defined by the Environment Agency, need to take into account flooding. And it wasn't a December update specifically, but there have been references in the NPPF for a little while in terms of needing to make reference to other sources of flooding too. So things like surface water flooding or groundwater flooding, and that if your development was affected by those, that they too needed to be taken into account with appropriate studies, be it flood risk assessments or whatnot. The December update kind of made it clearer that in taking into account all those sources of flooding, that if a development or parts of development were outside of those areas, so be it surface water flooding, that perhaps you didn't need to undertake a sequential test. However, that's not been applied necessarily in the most consistent way. Councils have interpreted that differently. There's been some case law around that. There's been different appeal decisions around that. So ultimately that led to the government reviewing the planning practice guidance. So the planning practice guidance is the government's other kind of policy,
it's more of a guide, isn't it?
Policy area in addition to the NPPF that explains how local authorities and decision making should work in relation to lots of different issues. But they've taken the opportunity to update the PPG specifically in relation to flood risk. So just a few highlights on that really. Firstly, the government's clarified the instances in which applicants need not apply a sequential test. So I just mentioned that the NPPF had made it clear that you do need to do a sequential test in instances where the development is affected by flood risk, and that's flood risk in all its forms, including instances in which climate change may increase flood risk on a particular site. But the PPG goes a little step further and says that local authorities should take a pragmatic approach though to that, and what that seems to suggest is that if a site-specific flood risk assessment states that although an area might be at risk from surface water flooding, if it can be made safe for its lifetime, particularly in terms of its layout and its design and any mitigation measures that would be put forward, then the sequential test need not necessarily apply in that instance. Some people have described that as a watering down. I'm not going to give it any label at this point. What I will say though is it's really best, I think, that developers engage with us via pre-app or during their planning application, and definitely seek proper advice from their flood risk consultants on the matter, because where flood risk assessment is submitted with a particular development and it's attempting to demonstrate that a sequential test doesn't need to be undertaken because the development is safe, that needs to be spelt out very clearly and evidenced properly. And I think we'll just have to wait and see what happens really in terms of how those developments come forward.
Yeah, no, absolutely.
Some other bits that were updated as well as part of that PPG update include a bit more of an explanation from government about the instances, or not the instances, the area that a sequential test might apply to. So they've attempted to give a bit of a steer about that. It's always been a bit of a thing, I think, that local authorities and developers together have struggled with. You do have to do the sequential test. So let's say that's what you have to do in this instance. Which area do you apply that to? We haven't had a blanket approach to that. We've always considered it case by case. But I think it's fair to say maybe sometimes our areas have been quite broad. We've tended to advise about needing to look at the whole district when it comes to housing, because we do as an authority deliver housing across the district. Sometimes we've taken a bit more of a pragmatic approach and looked at that in terms of maybe a housing market area. So if it's, in the south of the district, for example, maybe we said, well, okay, fine, don't look at the north of the district, but do see if there are sites available in Eastbourne, or maybe some of our neighbouring authority areas. The PPG just seems to give a bit of a steer that maybe sequential tests with a smaller geographical area might be appropriate. But again, I think it's best to just flag really at this stage that maybe you should have those conversations with us if you're unsure about how that needs to be applied. And I've just mentioned it, but one of the updates was that the area of search might need to cross local planning authority boundaries. So maybe there's been some misunderstanding about that in the past in some sectors where they thought that search areas only should be within kind of administrative boundaries, but they can extend broader than that. And then there's some other updates in there about what constitutes a site that's reasonably available as an alternative site. So do take a look at the PPG and what it says in terms of how we assess what's reasonably available when that's flagged up during the sequential test. And then there's further update in the PPG as well about how the absence of a 5-year housing land supply, which, as listeners will be aware, is the situation for Wealden at the moment, isn't relevant when undertaking the sequential test. However, it does provide clarity, and this is an approach that I've noticed the planning inspectorate have been taking for a little while now anyway, that regardless of how the sequential test is applied, or even if it's been applied in the first place when the applicant has made a submission to the council, it can be something that's factored in the planning balance when it comes to weighing up the benefits and disbenefits of a scheme. So whatever the outcome of a sequential test, be it test not done, test not agreed, some outcome from the test, be it in the developer's favour or the council's arguing it, there's still an opportunity or a requirement rather to make sure that that's properly taken into account when concluding on whether the proposal is acceptable or not, factoring in our housing land supply position. So those are some of the main things I've noted from the update.
It provides some clarity, doesn't it? It's, so that is helpful in that respect, and at least they've taken the time, but they've got to a point where we've got the PPG updated, so that's good. Or just to add, Sam, that locally we've just published an SFOA. So an SFOA is a strategic flood risk assessment for the south of our district, and we're looking to also update the northern half of our district, which is actually most of the district, because it's quite a large area, the north of our district, and that's hopefully coming before the Big 18 that we've previously spoken around. So we'll have a coverage across the whole district at that stage as well.
And I think that's really pertinent to mention that, actually, because not that it happens all the time, but one of the things I have noticed on occasion is that when it comes to understanding what flood risk there is within the district, there can sometimes be a tendency to focus on what the Environment Agency publish, what you might be able to ascertain from the information shared by the lead local flood authority. There isn't always a reference to the strategic flood risk assessment though, but the point is you really need to look at those documents, because that will help with identifying what all those sources of flooding are. Between all those different sources is how you identify whether a site is in a flood zone or not, which everyone's, like I said at the beginning of the conversation, familiar with, but then also identifying those instances where there are local surface water flooding issues or local groundwater issues, and also how climate change is being factored in as well. So definitely make sure that you have a look at that information, and we'll include links to those things in our notes to help with that. Probably not best to get into too much of a discussion, I think, about what we think might be missing from or what the issues might be with the PPG, but if anybody's interested in terms of reading around the subject, there are commentaries out there about these changes and kind of what it might mean otherwise, or what things could be focused on in the future. But I mean, a couple to highlight really. Climate change, flooding and flood risk does take into account for climate change, and James, that's what the SFRA does, right?
Absolutely.
But that's always changing as well. Our understanding of how climate change works is, kind of a moving feast, isn't it, in terms of that field of work, and it's not beyond the realm of possibility that
Yeah.
uplift that would need to be applied into understanding the flood risk could change in the future. So
absolutely, and obviously even in this plan that we're preparing, this is the second time we've reviewed that, so that gives you it does tell us that there's quite a lot going on around this area of work.
So I suppose we're just letting people know that we're conscious of those things, but we can still ultimately only make decisions in relation to the guidance as it exists at the time. But we'll try our best to make sure that things like mitigation, the design of drainage systems and the maintenance of those drainage systems are all factored into. That certainly has to be spelled out anyway. The PPG makes it clearer that those things need to be demonstrated if we're going to disapply the sequential test, but they need to be explained whatever the circumstances, because we will always seek to make sure that developments come forward with appropriate drainage schemes that are going to be designed well and maintained for the lifetime of the development. But just a few updates from us today about local plan stuff and changes to the PPG in terms of flood risk. Was there anything else you wanted to add, James?
No, not at this stage. So
in which case, that's it from us today. So thanks for listening and see you next time.
Yeah, thank you.